Before we begin, just some logistical issues. This talk is going to be recorded, but might not be released, depending if I'm going to talk about things that I shouldn't talk about. So, show of hands, would you prefer me to go into deeper details and give names of companies? That means there will be no recording. Okay, good. Second thing, as Mark said eloquently yesterday, this is not another ChatGPT talk. Although I used to talk about AI a lot, even specifically here in T2. I was here 5-6 years ago talking about AI and what kind of threats and landscapes they are going to see. Not in that business anymore, not doing that anymore, primarily because there's absolutely no money in it. I still have a lot of opinions, so if you would like to hear my opinions about anything, just talk to me, please. And I did use Midjourney extensively during the presentation, so I really like it. I think that it has a lot of potential, and it saved me a lot of money on designers. So let's start. Closing the gap, talking about incident response and what can you do in order to make incident response better at your organization. I'll start by why you should listen to me. Absolutely no reason. Some background, I have a company that does IR, which might be a good incentive to talk about IR, might not be. I'm also very active in the community. I'm one of the leaders of B-Sides Tel Aviv, which is a large community-led conference in Israel, about 1,800 attendees happening in the summer. So if you're ever too tired of Helsinki, come over to Tel Aviv, it'll be fun. Other than that, I used to speak a lot around the world. Then something funny happened around 2020 and I stopped traveling, but we'll get to that in a moment. Some numbers. I've been a professional cybersecurity, something or other, for more than 25 years. I've been around computers even longer than that. My first computer was a Commodore 128D, for those of you who remember what that means. Profero has been around for a bit over 3 years since we established it. Sorry, someone is really bothering me. And we had over 150 documented incidents, a bit more than that because we have undocumented incidents where the customer calls this and we said, no, this is not an incident, go back to sleep. But over 150 actual incidents. As I said, I've been here before. If you really, really care, the QR codes will lead you into a phishing site. But after you pass that gate, you can get into the videos of my previous talks. If you want to learn more about the AI threat landscape, and if you don't, that's perfectly fine. So I want to start with some, let's call it moral motivation. Why would I go into incident response? First of all, whoever has ever done incident response is like the worst job ever. Anyone in the room doing incident response, done incident response, like 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 people, I'm so sorry for you. So I've been doing this professionally for 3 years, and I really don't have a lot of excuses. There's a lot of stress involved, repeated stress injuries, so there's a lot of stress involved. Usually not a lot of sleep. It's very hard work. It's hard work because it's a hard technical work. It's a hard work because you have to work with customers who don't know anything about security, usually don't know anything about IT. Their IT people usually don't know anything about IT or security. And you have to battle all of that with a lot of politics and pressure on top. And you have to be very deeply technical. You can't be an incident response person who doesn't really know their shit. Sorry about the language. I do encounter from time to time incident response people who are not deeply technical, and the end result of that is that the customers reach out to us after they had the first incident response company come in. So if you're not inclined in that direction, don't do this. This is not that beneficial. And all of that effort, all of that time, all of that energy is wasted on an organization that's not even yours. So organization will be replaced every week, every 2 weeks. You will be in another incident and doing another thing for someone else. So it might not be the life for everyone. So why is it the life for us? So a little background story. When I was here last time, we were on the verge of closing our term sheet for a startup called Secure AI. Secure AI was a startup in the world of how to secure AI technology models against theft, against manipulation, etc. I was here on stage showing how you can manipulate and steal data from AI models, etc. However, then early January 2020, we were reached out by the Israeli government, by the Ministry of Health, and they asked us to come and solve a problem for them, something with a contact tracing application. Funny story for another time. But after we sat down with the epidemiologist, with the doctors in charge of running the pandemic, we understood that there's not going to be a market for a niche product for the next couple of years. So we decided to pivot into something else and do something that we knew there's money in it, and we knew that we can do well, which is go into incident response. But why incident response specifically? From my own experience, at the top of this pyramid, securing AI models was very, very interesting, very deeply technical for me, very exciting, and absolutely no one in the world cared about that. That's not an interesting field with impact on the world. A bit lower than that, you might have heard about Spectre and Meltdown at the time. So I did not say so, but I was at Intel. I was a manager at Intel and one of the members of the task force for Spectre and Meltdown, both through the disclosure, building the mitigation, releasing them to the public. And I have to say, a couple of years after that, this is still not a very relevant use case for almost anything. Very interesting technically, very low level, very deeply technical, no impact on the world, nothing. And if you go down the ladder here, targeted attacks, very interesting. I went into things like, anyone heard about someone called NSO, a group called NSO? They have a software called Pegasus. So I've been somewhat vocal against NSO and doing some research about how this proliferated, how they got into different places. Again, targeted attacks, not really interesting, not a lot of impact on the world. A lot of PR, but nothing really, really exciting. But I wanted, and my partner wanted to do something that actually had some impact. And what we found early during COVID and all throughout COVID was that large organizations have a lot of budget. They can go to Mandiant, they can go to Signia, they can go to SecureWorks, they can go to all of the large companies and get help when they need help. But the small companies, SMBs, SMEs, have no one to turn to. And it was a huge problem because they were affected by attacks no less than the big enterprises. But they didn't have any kind of solution, no recourse when they were. So why is that the case? Or in a larger way, what does the IR field look like? So if you're not familiar with it, IR is basically consultants, IR specialists, IR consultants, IR experts, however you want to call them. Basically consultants, and usually, as I said, not very deeply technical. You'll see a lot of consultants say, yes, we do IR, and we also do PT, and we'll do a risk assessment, and we also do your ISO 27001. So no one specializes in IR, a lot of amateurs out there. The second thing is, it's not scalable. One-man shop, three-man shop, five-man shop, it's not scalable. You can't give your services to too many customers, or you will run out of hours in the day. Also, because they're not focused on SMBs and SMEs, they all fight for the same enterprise clients, and nobody gives service to the smaller markets, well, not necessarily smaller markets, but smaller players in the market. And that was double-pressed. And lastly, and I think one of the most important aspects that shape this market is that consultants, like lawyers, bill by the hour. So they are both incentivized into stretching out engagement for as long as possible while bleeding the customer. So for us, this was like a predatory practice. We don't like to do this. We also don't like ambulance chasers in general. So we wanted to build something else and to do something more interesting that actually has some benefit to the community. The interest from the company side is we need to resolve this fast. We are losing money every day, every hour that the business is not operating. And people are on a deadline to report to the regulator because if they miss that deadline, they're going to get screwed over by the government. So every time that the system is down, they're losing money. If they pay the ransomware, they might get back to business faster, but there's a lot of pressure not to pay ransomware. Sorry. And lastly, nobody is giving them the options saying, okay, this is the entire gamut of things that you can do. You can choose A, B, or C, and that's going to be the ramification to your business. Make a business decision. You decide what's best for you. Consultants come in, legal firms come in and say, this is the only path that you have to take. Now 3 weeks until we can get back to business. That's not necessarily the right answer, not necessarily the only answer. So during this talk, I'm going to walk you through a couple of use cases. They're all true stories. I'll name names and give you some background about what worked and what didn't work. But I want to emphasize this 48-hour gap and describe why this is one of the big motivators and big pushes from the board of directors into resolving incidents fast. So a lot of geographies have, or a lot of territories have some sort of regulator that is mandating by law that if you have a material breach of your company, you have to report it to the regulator under some time frame, usually 48 hours. And if you don't report it during that 48 hours, you might be liable and someone might sue you. So the companies have a problem. If they detect a breach, they have to report it if it's a material breach. If it's not a material breach, they don't have to report it. But you only have 48 hours to discover if this is a material breach or not. If you report that this was not a material breach later, it doesn't matter. Your stock price already took a hit. You already had to report that you had a possible material breach. But no one is able to respond fast enough to give you the information that you need as a customer in order to make these informed decisions. If they don't report, the regulator is going to chew them up. And if they do report and they missed it, meaning that it was some IT fluke, it wasn't really an incident, then they reported, they got screwed over, but nothing really happened. So they got screwed over twice. So a lot of them have this dilemma, should they even report at all? Or even if they do report, should they, like a big report, small report, maybe try to masquerade as something else, which gave rise to the practices that we see today where companies either don't report anything at all or report things in a very confusing language, so it'll be very difficult for you to understand what really happened. Example in point, anyone familiar with the LastPass breach? All 3 different announcements? Maybe, okay. I have a completely different talk about that, but LastPass went ahead and gave 3 different announcements or declarations about what happened in the company, and every time they gave a few more details, a little bit more details. And what happened practically is that if you were a customer of LastPass and you fully understood from the first disclosure that you should replace everything, then you're in a good position. But if only after 3 different disclosures and 5 months you finally understood that you had to replace everything, it's a bit too late. So the incentive in the market is not to really tell the truth, and it's a problem. Okay, Midjourney, really like it. Okay, so how does an incident report, how does the incident response look like? So usually there's some threat in your network, and it's usually there for quite some time before you even detect it. Most companies don't detect their threat in the network and respond in a matter of hours. There are some that do. Most have weeks, if not months, before something happened. Most of the customers that reach out to us have someone in their network, I don't know, on average between 8 to 12 weeks at least, before they were detected. And usually they were detected because something stupid happened. I'll give an example. A large cybersecurity firm found out that their firewall had spikes in their CPU. So the IT went in to investigate why does the firewall have spike in the CPUs, and they found out that the reason it has spikes in the CPU was that its feature for anti-bot detection was triggering again and again and again, and it was overloading the CPU. But the question was, why was it triggering? So they went deeper, and they found out that their network had an infestation of coin miners. So when there were like 3 coin miners, nothing happened because the CPU wasn't that large. When you have 3,000 coin miners, 3,000 different virtual machine coin mining, each one of them sending their mined blocks away to the Monero pool, each one triggering the firewall differently, you have 3,000 triggering every couple of minutes, CPU overload, finally IT notices something. Okay, so that's usually what happens in companies, and it's not such a far-fetched story. But let's say that somebody called us in, we start the clock. What happens at the usual engagement? So it takes between 12 hours to 36 hours to actually engage a company if you don't have a pre-existing arrangement. It sounds like a lot of time, and it is a lot of time because you have to know someone, you have to call someone, you have to get a contract in place, get it signed. That's a lot of time. Then it takes between 1 and 3 days to actually get access to the systems. This is one of the points that really drives me crazy. This is valuable time during an incident, completely lost on logistics. Who knows the guy that knows how to create new users on a firewall or add someone new to the VPN or get me admin rights to the Office 365? We are wasting so much time on such trivialities where it's nothing even remotely related to the incident, just getting credentials to check what was going on. The rest of the incident, getting data, doing the actual investigation, planning the mitigation and deploying mitigations, and then going into remediation phase will take even longer than that. You saw the timescales for huge companies yesterday in the talks about Maersk. But even for smaller companies, we're talking of something between weeks to start the remediation phase, to months to start the remediation phase. So when you're thinking about incidents, you don't have to think about how long will it take me to close the incident. You might close the incident in 5 days, or 3 days, I don't know. But it'll take you weeks to recover, and you have to consider that as well. The biggest time wasters that we see repeatedly again and again is how long it takes you to engage an IR team, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. How long it takes you to get access to data, to get access to logs, to get access to S3 buckets hosting logs, to get access to your internal networks data lake, if you have one, et cetera, et cetera. It takes a lot of time. Moving that data from place to place for analysis also takes a lot of time, which usually people don't consider. Think about this scenario. Again, real use case, a large retail company in Brazil had one of their ESXi servers compromised and a virtual machine with some attackers' payloads sitting on it. We said, excellent, we want image of that machine in our lab to start analysis. Sounds easy. 936 gigabytes that we had to move from Brazil to our data center in Israel. We are very, very good at downloading stuff. We are insidiously crappy at uploading stuff. There are no mechanisms or serious mechanism for high bandwidth, high resilience, low latency uploads when you need them. And we're talking about hundreds of gigabytes, terabytes of data that you need to move from place to place. If you had to use the S3 interface for uploads or Dropbox or mega uploads or whatever you think about the limits of around 10 megabytes per second upload speeds. That's the limits. We had to build and design our own upload system so we can work at scale, because otherwise we will never be able to upload. Think about 3 days just to get the uploads. It would be faster to put it on an airplane and fly the disk over. That's insane. But that's the reality, and it's something you need to consider. The investigation itself also takes time. The investigation itself is dependent on humans, on the large part, and on automation on the smaller part. But if you don't have that automation in place, or you're not sure what you're looking for, and you don't have the setup to look for those things, you don't have the technological backend to look for those things, it's going to take you longer. If you don't have enough manpower, it's going to take you longer. If you don't have specialists, it's going to take you longer. And these are kind of things that you need to think about when you're planning your IR readiness. How are you going to manage these kinds of incidents? Do I know some reverse engineers that can reverse engineer the malware when needed? Maybe you don't. How do you acquire someone like that? You need answers, and you need them fast. It's a big problem. In the overall cybersecurity strategic landscape, if I can say, we used to look at things very differently. We used to say the perimeter is everything, let's have a very strong perimeter. Then we learned that perimeter is crap, doesn't really worth anything. Then we learned that people that go and work remotely from home don't even understand how VPNs work. Then we learned that perimeter really doesn't mean anything. We went into a full prevention mode. We deployed the prevention appliances of all sorts. The amount of false positives is not worth the effort at all. So prevention doesn't work. We are now at the detection phase of the world, where detection kind of works, sometimes maybe. And usually what happens, we move into, let's call it the EDR phase of the world, where you might not be able to prevent something, you might not be able to detect something, or you might be able to understand something happened, but you didn't detect it. But you have to have response capabilities, because whatever you assume, whatever your playbook is, at some point you would like to respond. So you have to have that response infrastructure built before you actually have an incident, so you can actually do something. Detection, as a general rule, is crappy. And it's crappy for a lot of different reasons. I'll give a very nice, eloquent story, succinct story about this. We went into a company that were ransomware, and they contacted us. We went in. We usually do a questionnaire like, what's your security stack? What do you have? And said, we have CyberReason. We were very happy. CyberReason is a pretty good product overall. And we said, it's a good EDR. It has good detection capabilities. Let's see what CyberReason was able to see. So we got into the panel, the administration panel for CyberReason, and it was a Christmas tree. Everything was lit up. Everything was in red. It had detections all over, at least 3 weeks old. So we said, okay, you have an excellent product. You detected everything. What's going on? And then we found out in the configuration that nobody ever configured it to alert anyone. So there were no outbound alerts going on. So they paid for the appliance, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They paid for integration hours for someone to install and deploy EDR on all of the endpoints, which they did successfully, which is no small accomplishment. But no one was in charge of this in general. It was nobody's job to take care of this appliance in general, so nobody ever got the alerts. So what is that worth? Detection can only take you so far. You actually have to do something with them. And more than that, even if you do detect something, do you have the capabilities or do you have the plans in place to act upon those detections if they happen? Usually, and this is a statistic that I feel very confident to give after more than about 200 incidents, usually incidents happen somewhere between we're talking the Israeli time zone, so it's the same as Finland time zone, somewhere between late Thursday night to early Friday morning, or Friday afternoon. It's like 90% of incidents happen in that time frame, 10% in other time frames. So we already geared up in the way that we structured it. So we know that we need more manpower at that hours to respond to crises because they will happen. Are you set up to do the same? Usually Friday afternoon, people go home. Nobody is looking at the alert manager anymore. That means that all the way to Monday morning, nobody's going to look at those screens. It might be a big issue. Okay. This is just a temporary slide to make sure that everybody is listening. Heads nodding. Yeah, okay. This is not Midjourney. This was actually suggested by Microsoft PowerPoint, which really amazed me because they were able to integrate colors and text at the same time. A big step forward for PowerPoint. Okay, so what would happen if you had very slow incident response? If you detected a threat and it took you a day to respond, or a week to respond, or 3 weeks to respond, what does that mean to your business? Usually the answer to that is the detection didn't mean anything. Because if you're slow to respond, why does it matter if the detection will trigger in 1 minute or in 5 minutes if your response time is 3 weeks? So you have to weigh what do you want to invest in more in order to make this happen. And how long would this threat be in your system before you actually responded to it? And as I said, it might be weeks, months before you actually detected it, and it might be too late when you detected it. Do you have any kind of resiliency, any kind of plan to do something about it? Usually you don't. And when you don't, how relevant is your response time? If you know that you have people on call and they will respond in 48 hours, maybe detecting things in 5 minutes is not very important. So you have to consider that as well. And a good example of that is the numbers shared yesterday in Maersk. It took 20 minutes up to an hour to encrypt everything in a 50,000 endpoint enterprise. It will take less time in a 5,000 endpoint enterprise. It will take even less time in a 500 endpoint SME or SMB. So if it takes you 3 to 6 hours to respond, by the time that you detect, by the time that you respond, everything will be encrypted. So you have to take that into your consideration as well. What do you do when all of the systems are encrypted? How are you going to work? And I'll talk about that in a moment. Let's jump ahead. Okay. So when you're doing incident response, you have to think about all of these things. And in general, you need some procedure at hand to handle this situation. And usually it should be on a paper somewhere because you won't have access to digital infrastructure if something really important or a crisis happens. And also changes between organizations. Different organizations values different things, have different emphasis on what they want to do. And resolving an incident is a good metric for me to try to convince people it's better to do it fast, which I'm trying to convince you as well. But also it's a good metric internally to say, okay, we detected something. It was just an employee clicking a phishing email. We resolved that in under an hour. Good. That means someone saw the detection, actually did something with it under an hour. You're doing well. If it takes you 2 days, you're not doing well. You need to do something about that. So this is a good metric to track. But also think about bigger problems. Real story, a publicly traded company had an infiltration of its system without touching any of the network assets. So the story went like this. We were called in. the attacker was blackmailing the company, saying that I have all of your code repositories and I'm going to leak them unless you pay me X number of Bitcoins. So they had no idea how we got into their system. There was no trace of anything going wrong in one of their systems. So they called us in, and we did the same investigation. We found no trace of anyone touching anything over the network. There was no fingerprints of anything happening. So we started to dig deeper. And we found that the attacker got in by a circumstitious route that was not very expected, but we could trace it. So he first broke into their organization Slack. How did he do that? One of the employees used the same credentials for the work Slack as they did for one of the social websites, and that website was breached. So he got into the Slack. From Slack, he started searching the history, the messages history on Slack, and he found credentials to access the company Jira. Went into the Jira, started searching the history of Jira for all tickets, closed tickets, and he found in one of the tickets the credentials to get into the enterprise GitLab account. And there he spun up another instance in EC2 for a GitLab runner. The way GitLab works, that every time that you build, the compile code, you build a job, it does a round robin between the different runners. Each time it will select a different runner, do the build, and release it, or whatever it needs to do. When he added another runner, he just had to wait patiently until 630 different repositories that the company had were round robin to his EC2 instance on Amazon, outside their account and control, and then he had copy of all of the company code. And he didn't breach the company itself. He did not install any piece of malware. He did not do any of that. So tracing this was, well, not easy, but it's possible to do so. But think about the ramification. We stopped him, we paid him, we threatened him, it doesn't really matter. Someone has access to 630 repositories of your company, comprising about 12 years of written code. Would you like to guess how many access keys, passwords, tokens, etc., were in that 630 repositories?
0.
Well, no. A bit larger than 0. Well, high number of tens of thousands, yes. So most of them are not applicable anymore, but we had to build the harness to go and scan all of the different repositories, all of the different commits on the entire tree for each repository to get those credentials, pinpoint the location and time where he got access to those repositories, and say, okay, you have to replace all credentials from the beginning of time up to that date, and rotate all keys from that date going forward, usually without committing them into the code, hopefully. And it was a huge effort. It took weeks to rotate all of those keys, even though that we prioritize them, even though that we... Think about it in your organization. How long would it take you to rotate 1,000 keys? Then think about how long it would take you to rotate 10,000 keys. Can you even do that? Do you even have the capabilities to understand how many keys you have? It's a big problem that if you think about ahead of time, you can really cut the mean time to response on that. Most organizations are not...
Were they considering taking something like Atlassian Vault into use?
We recommended that. We actually recommend using HashiCorp Vault, which I think has a bit better APIs. But the problem with that was not the implementation of the HashiCorp Vault, was going over all of the code and integrating new APIs to reach something outbound. Some of them didn't have any outbound connections. For example, a lot of the jobs that they had, the CI/CD jobs, were reliant on having hard-coded passwords or tokens in the code itself. They had no mechanism to contact some external entity to fetch it. So that was our recommendation, but it took weeks to implement. Yeah.
Related to, you said there would be GitLab
Yeah.
in play as well. Nowadays, GitLab offers a secrets detection tool. Did you try that one?
Side story, I'd be happy to answer that outside because I did a lot of research on that. But to make it concise, there are lots of open source tools. Trufflehog is now one of the best, and also a public company, and not public, they're a private company, but they're also offering a commercial service, sorry. There used to be GitLeaks, there used to be other secret detection capabilities. Most of them are crap. Think about something that does regular expression at a large scale. This is the secret detection engine for most companies. A better detection engine will capture other things like relationship to codes. Is it just a variable named that's called secret or is actually a secret? And the better ones will also take those secrets and validate them. For example, AWS today has a mechanism to say, here is a token, and I'll tell you if it's still valid or if it's expired. So that can take down a lot of your effort by focusing just on actual usable credentials, not old expired credentials. End of brackets. Okay. Doing all of that thinking in advance can really cut down on your time to response, which is, again, as I said, one of the biggest things that you should focus on. Okay, let's talk a bit about how to mitigate threats. Detecting threats is only half the problem. You know that there is something going on. Maybe a user clicked on something. Maybe you got a detection in your SIM. Another brackets, I think SIMs are crap. Another opinion that we can discuss later. What do you do with it? Okay, now you know something. Do you have the tools to investigate it? Usually you don't. How do you do forensic captures? There was a good debate or discussion yesterday. Mark said that collecting forensics images slowed things down, which is absolutely true. If you intend to go into court, then you have to do a chain of custody and contain hashes of everything, a detailed log of every action that you've performed. This takes a lot of time. You can do the exact same forensic capture without all of that because you don't intend to go to court and cut down a lot of the time. It's a business decision. Are you planning to sue someone or are you trying to resolve as fast as possible? Think about that as well. Now you have a detection somewhere. You want to isolate. Do you have the capability to isolate your network? It's a big question. Do you have a kill switch somewhere that says, I can phone Australia and kill the entire data center at a single blow of a master switch? Usually companies don't have that. And if they do, usually there are backup mechanisms that they didn't think about, and they'll get screwed over that way. Something that comes to mind, I think I mentioned in one of my conversations yesterday, 2015, Ukraine was, electrical infrastructure was attacked by MEDOC, the same kind of precursor to NotPetya. And they went ahead and shut down the internet access. They physically went and pull out the plugs from the router connecting to outbound. However, what they didn't take into consideration that they had two separate ISDN backup lines into the power room, or I don't know, power control room. They had two different backups that the attackers knew about, and they got back in, but they didn't know about them because nobody wrote down that they have those backups in case they needed them. So there probably are some backups around that you're not aware of. Can you do single endpoint isolation if needed? Or if not, think about how you can do that. That can save you a lot of trouble, a lot of trouble. And think about this as well. If you have a reliable indicator of compromise, you know that someone is contacting this address and it's malicious, or somebody's downloaded that binary and it's malicious. How fast can you take that IOC and deploy it over your entire fleet to get answers? Is it the only computer contacting that malicious address? Do I have 10 computers contacting that malicious, maybe 1,000 computers? How fast can you get those answers? Usually you already have the tools to get those answers, but you're not thinking about using them in that way. I'll give an example in a moment. Okay. How do you get data from compromised machines? Another thing that you should consider, you have a machine, you know it's malicious, there's something malicious running on it, you isolated it, now what? How do you investigate an isolated machine? Do you take it into a clean room and some specialist working in a white keyboard hanging from the ceiling while it touches it? Probably not. So you want some sort of solution where you can, on one hand, isolate the machine, and on the other hand, keep investigating it and get the answers that you need. There are solutions like that. They are called EDRs. Use them. They're built for that purpose. Remote access, also a big thing. When we built the company, one of the things that we decided that we don't want to do is fly all over the world. Well, flying to Helsinki is nice. Doing it once a week, it's not that nice. So we built a remote company under the assumption that nobody really needs to fly anywhere in order to touch a keyboard. And for the large part, that came true over the last 3 years. There are exceptions. If you're working in the, I don't know, the military or security industry, they're air-gapped. I accept that. If you're working on critical infrastructure, you'll have to fly over. I accept that. But most of IT, most of security is not the military-industrial complex or critical infrastructure. So for everything else, remote solutions are possible. And also, if you have the data, and I'll assume that you'll get the data at some point or another, you'll have to analyze it. You have to be familiar with the tools that do analysis on different types of data. Some of them are commercial, you have to buy a license. Some of them are free, open source, but you have to learn how to use them. So try to do all of that before an incident happens. And lastly, how do you move from doing the investigation to moving into mitigation? I'll give an example. We had a large ransomware attack, and the company was not willing to pay anything and cut all communication with the attackers, which is fine, I'm okay with it. And the reason they did that was because they had backups, and they had a good, solid backup plan where you back up everything a couple of times a day, and each day they have an offsite, and every week they have tapes, and every 3 months it's in a vault. So they're feeling very, very secure in their ability to recover from backups, which was true, they had good backups. However, the question was, how long was the attacker in the system, and how long do you go in the backups to find a backup that had no attacker code on it? This takes time, and usually quite a lot of time. I'll give the same story from a different angle. There was a customer that built a really nice backup system where they back up everything off-site with a diode, only one-way direction, so nothing can come out of it, etc. And it was backing up something on the order of 15 terabytes of data. So I innocently asked, okay, how long would it take you to rebuild your entire network infrastructure from 15 terabytes of data sitting in an off-site facility? So we did some back-of-the-envelope calculation. How long would it take you to move 15 terabytes of data? So you can do it over a network connection. Too much data, it takes weeks. And you can physically ferry them, but you have to copy the data into new drives. Copying 15 terabytes of data takes time. It's not immediate. It would take, on paper, at least a week to recover, even if you have all of the backups and all of the data, just because of logistics. And it's not immediate. People think about backup, oh, I'll just restore from backup and everything will be fine. It takes time to acquit the backups to make sure that they're clean. It takes time to move data. It takes time to rebuild your data center, or even think about a very simple problem. Rebuilding a domain controller, even though you have the backup, takes time. It doesn't take 15 minutes. Doing that for 5 domain controllers take even longer. So that is something that you also should consider. Okay, something closer to home. We had well, for us, was an interesting case. A large hotel company here in Europe. They had branches, how do you call it, localities in France, Germany, and Spain. A large hotel chain. And they were hit by ransomware, so none of the check-in, check-out, nothing worked, and they were very unhappy about that. And they called us. We have a nice reputation. We were happy to take their call. They heard our prices, and they said, okay, you know what, we'll find some consultant to do this. I said, well, fine, that's okay. Not everybody is happy with us. Find someone else, we'll help you find someone else. And they looked around for a lot of time, and what they found out was that consultants can't really cover multinational corporates. Because if you're working in a couple of different locations, geographies, or even if you're working on a couple of different continents, working with a 3-5 person IR company is not really going to make that work. You can't support that with 3 to 5 people. And the problem with that was that they had to circle back and come back to us, pricing regardless, because they didn't have any other solution. So if you are a multinational corporate and you have a multi-site facility and you have a large network that has different segments that affect each other, think about that when you're going to go into an IR mode. You now have a big incident. Do you have the support that you need, or you're going to waste a lot of time trying to even hire the right company to help you? They wasted 10 days. 10 days in IR is like, I don't know, eternity. It was too late to do almost anything. I'll give an example why it's too late. Any guess on how long people keep logs? What's the time retention for most logs in IT systems? 7 days, you said what? 0 minutes, depending on the log, that's true.
5 megabytes.
That is also true for Linux operating systems. Usually it's too short. One of the things that we care about most is the DNS logs from the domain controllers, because they do the actual resolving, so we can map between something that happened externally into something that happened internally. These logs are rotated every 48 hours or 10 megabytes or so of size. That means if you're too late coming in, you won't have any visibility into what happened. You'll have to work through different routes. A lot of IT companies or a lot of IT people don't keep security logs because they don't help them in their day-to-day lives in any way. So why waste time, effort, and money on something that they don't use? As security people, we really, really care about those logs, but we don't have them. So that's something also you need to plan ahead. 10 days coming into an incident after 10 days, that means that even some of those logs that did exist, no longer relevant. That's very, very difficult, and it's something they need to consider. If it takes you 10 days to contract a company, you're going to get screwed over significantly just because of what you did. Talking about screwing over, we're all security professionals. We tend to view things from a security mindset or security perspective. In a big incident, there are a lot of other stakeholders that are not security related, and they don't even know what security is, nor do they care. You're just another seat in the table with a lot of different participants. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, you have a board of directors meeting, you have the CEO, you have the CIO, you have the CFO, you have the chief legal officer, you have the chief of head HR or PR, marketing, whoever is there around the table. This is just from the company side. Now you have consultants, you have an external PR company, you have a spokesperson, you have a negotiator, you have a forensics team, you have usually some outside legal, not their own legal, but some outside legal company to cover their assets as needed. That's a lot of people around the table. And in order to get anything done with a group of more than 3 people might be a bit difficult. Getting those people around the table is also very difficult. Zoom makes it a bit easier. Getting them into a physical room is a bit harder. In order to get decisions made in the time frame that we're talking about, this is something you have to consider ahead of time. Who are those people? Who calls those people? Who has their phone numbers? Are they flying in? Are they connecting over Zoom? Do they know that they are on call if something happens? A lot of time they don't. And then you have to scramble around like, I don't know, headless chickens running around trying to get this set up so decisions can be made. A lot of time is wasted. And this is actually something that we see in about 60% of cases, 60, 70% of cases. We are working in parallel because we know this is going to take hours to days to set up. So we start doing everything else in parallel. Okay. Effective communications. I'm not talking about how to be a good PR person, talking about how to actually get things done. So effective communication usually means that you know who you need to talk to. Okay, I have to go a bit faster. You need to know who you need to talk to. And that means that you need to know the roles, responsibilities, phone numbers of everyone. Somehow during incidents, everybody assumes that they're going to have that data. Nobody has that data. You need to open a new account on the VPN. Nobody knows who's the guy that does that. You need to reach out to the person responsible for the firewalls. Nobody knows where she lives. Nobody knows her phone number. We waste a lot of time and effort on these logistics. Okay. Another thing, and this is a, well, somewhat funny story. We always recommend our customers, whenever you have an incident, no matter the reason, use out-of-band communications. Use out-of-band communication because your own communication system might be compromised. Attackers love sitting on emails, reading emails. They also love sitting on Teams, joining Teams channels, etc. Not so much on Slack for some reason, but Teams is very popular. And they might be, that the incident might be from an internal employee, rogue employee. So there's really not a good use case for saying, let's use the company infrastructure to discuss this really, really sensitive matter. When companies do that, so funny things happen. For example, we were in a ransomware case that was very popular about 2-3 years ago, very public. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Latin America. There was a big retail company called Americanas. So it's a multi-billion-dollar company, and they had a negotiation issue. The negotiation issue was that we were talking to them in our out-of-band communication, and they were talking internally without us in their own internal communication system, which was Teams, where the attacker was present, where he took screenshots and placed them on Telegram and saying they don't know how to negotiate, and making fun of all of them. And it got worse because he got the phone number of the CTO of the company, and he started phoning her saying, "Bitch, wake up, pay our money." So there's no real good use case for using internal comms when there's an incident. Build external do WhatsApp groups, do Signal, it doesn't matter. Just don't use internal communication when you have sensitive matters. It'll come back and bite you. Another thing that is, funnily enough, when there is a big ransomware event, bandwidth is abundant. You have all the bandwidth you want to do anything you want. Usually bandwidth is not a problem. Configuring firewalls, going through network segmentation is a problem. So having that procedure in place, opening ports, getting to the right people to do that when you need to access a machine is a big problem and might cut a lot of time. Contra use case. This is a case that we were not involved in. In Israel, an insurance company called Shirbit was hacked by a threat actor, by a nation state, a nation called Iran. You might have heard of them. And they did not try to ransom them for money. They were trying to expose or shock and awe as much as possible, like a terror campaign, trying to leak ID documents, passports of people, showing that everything is now public, everything, trying to terrorize as much as possible. And the problem here was that the CEO of that company did not heed the advice of his legal team or his security team or the other security team that they brought in. And he decided to go and talk to the press directly, trying to settle the spirits and say everybody should be aligned. And he started speaking, well, garbage. Yeah, I don't know what came over him, but he gave untruthful statements. He said the incident was over when it was not. He said that they know who the attackers were when they did not know who they were. He said the incident was over just before they leaked more documents. If you're in such an incident, the best course of action is to keep your mouth shut. And if you have to make a statement, work with your legal and PR team about making the right statement, and it has to be truthful. What happened to that CEO and that company later was that he was sued by the regulator for giving false statements. The company price went down, and they were bought out in about a third of their worth. So it wasn't a good experience for them. Again, Midjourney. Okay. Automate anything that you can. Invest time in doing automation. It's a good use of detection engineering time. It's a good use of engineering time, automating what you can to respond faster to incidents. I'll give two short examples because I don't have a lot of time. We used EDRs for customers in order to detect Log4j instances in their networks and their susceptibility, just by using the EDRs as remote endpoints to scan the internal network. We got the customers' answers about their exposures to Log4j in hours, while in other companies it took days to weeks to understand which appliances are susceptible or not. Same question as LastPass. We got questions from our customers saying, are we part of this LastPass incident? Do we even use LastPass in our organization? They had no idea, because as an organization, you might not be using LastPass Enterprise for your organization, but your workers might be using LastPass to store company credentials on LastPass. So they really, really cared to know if they are exposed or not. So we just used the EDRs to search the browsing history, which browser went to LastPass, and then we can give a list of host names saying this host name have LastPass installed and we're using it as early as 3 weeks ago, something like that. So you have those capabilities already deployed in your system, use them. They can do much more than just finding viruses or isolating machines. Threat intelligence. In general, I had the conversation yesterday about attribution. I'm not a big believer in attribution. I'm a big believer in threat intelligence. So there are lots of open source projects out there. MISP is probably the leading one between them. You can connect your data, your feed to it, and then you can use that data in order to find out malicious activities on your network. Pretty straightforward to do, not complex, a lot of benefits, very low effort. Lastly, and this is something that we see all the time, shadow IT or IT resources that nobody had any idea that they exist. When we went into the Americanas incident, they gave us their Amazon account to start scanning. They had a huge Amazon account. And about, I don't know, a week into the investigation, we already had like thousands of resources behind us, scanned resources behind us. They came in, oh, oops, we have another Amazon account. It's about twice as large as the one that you just looked at. Nobody knew that they had that an additional account. It was in another branch of the company. So be aware of it. Try to use tools to discover this. I'm very fond of Oxonius, if you've heard of it. It's an asset discovery and management. Try to discover hidden assets in your network. Hidden from you as security people, not hidden from people who actually use them. When thinking about automation, invest in thinking about scale. Solving a problem for 10 machines is not the same as solving a problem for 1,000 machines. Operating systems behave differently in places that you thought they will behave the same. Windows answers to the same APIs differently in different versions. Linux might give you a different answer. Your EDR might not give you the same responses in different places because it supports that feature on that platform, but does not support the same feature on that platform. But it doesn't tell you, it just gives you bad responses. So OSs are problematic. Don't over-engineer. If you have a solution, make it as simple as possible because you will have to change it in 6 months anyway. So don't over-invest time on it. And your security stack will change as well. You might have one vendor this year, a different vendor next year. Don't over-integrate, don't over-rely on whatever they have. It will change, your needs will change. And I say use Git for everything because Git is like my go-to, but use whatever source control that you have. It'll make your life so much easier. Another story, real story, we had a wave of incidents in Israel. There was a campaign, and we were one of the first companies to investigate the campaign. And we took the IOCs and released them to the community for a very specific reason where we don't make money on IOCs. I know there are lots of companies that do make money on IOCs and sell them. We don't believe in that. But because we had those IOCs, the next companies that got hit already had those IOCs in the system, got triggered very, very early on it, and could respond to it almost in a matter of like under an hour and close that incident. So if you have the capability to do so, talk to people who have IOCs, share IOCs, get IOCs, build that into your threat ingestion network. Okay, everybody still here? Okay, I don't know, maybe I made you sleepy. Last image that I really like. Okay. I'll try to talk a bit faster. Slow response to actual incidents is a big problem. Think ahead. Try your best to cut down times. Okay, I'll talk about screen. Skip that. Okay. Some assumptions that people make that are usually not true. As I said, don't use internal comms. Finding the right person in the organization will take you hours. You can cut that down by using pen and paper and having his phone number. Nobody does that. Deploying an agent in your system sounds like something you can do with a GPO relatively fast. The reality of it, in an incident, all hands on deck, it takes at least 24 hours to reach every point in the organization when you need to deploy an agent. If you deployed an agent ahead of time, it will be already present. If you're in an incident and now you need to deploy an agent, that's going to take you at least 24 hours. You need to take that into your account. Another thing, backups are nice. I really, really like backups. They rarely work. Test your backups. Always, always test your backups. Okay. I'll skip this. Okay. Key takeaways. Plan ahead, test your plan. Side note here, a lot of consultants or IR companies or whatever do tabletop exercises or do IR policies or paperwork, etc. Very, very nice, very useful for the board or whatever. Not really useful in the real world. It is useful if you take those policies, those papers, and talk to your IR people and say, does this make sense? Can you work under those timetables? Can you make this work? Are you missing anything to make this work? If you do that, those exercises are useful. If you do your tabletops without talking to an IR person in the room, those exercises are not worth anything because you will hit real problems when you get into a real incident. You will get into real problems in a real incident anyway, but that way at least you can improve your plan and make sure that it might work in the actual format. Logs. There are great logs out there. Nobody's taking logs properly. I think the single most common mistake that I see people do, they store logs in S3 buckets. They don't use the S3 log formatting where you have a year for the parent folder, then a month, then the day with a separate zip file. They just throw all of the logs in a single folder. This is very, very common. The result of that you have all of the logs, you just don't have any way to index and query them. So you want to ingest logs into Athena, you have to first sort them out, then ingest them into Athena. That takes a lot of time. Make sure that your logs are actually properly structured. Flexible infrastructure. Again, EDRs are very useful, but there are other tools out there. Think about how you can utilize that as security people in order to make these work. Another example of something that you can utilize in your organization, we get new CVEs, I don't know, every other week. Use a CVE as a training exercise. We now have a CVE. How long does it take you to understand how many systems are susceptible to that CVE in your organization? If it takes you days, you're moving too slow. Okay. Closing down the slides. Logistics is the biggest issue of IR, not the technical expertise. Technical expertise is the second biggest issue of IR, but usually it can be solved by preparing and planning ahead. If you're not sure what to do, if you would like to learn more or you would like to ask me any question, please do. I'm happy to share knowledge, information, answers to questions, whatever. Please do. Don't be concerned or afraid. I will keep your question confidential. And if you don't, think about all of those topics of where actual incidents go haywire in the real world. Think about how that's going to affect your work in your organization and plan ahead. And with that, thank you very much.